There are musicians and then there are people that just change the way you remember things. And, you know, I got to tell this story the best way I know how. As a young teenager, in the 80s, um, the funny thing is, this was my father's favorite funk artist, is Sly Stone. And I didn't really, played a lot of his music. Um, Growing up per se. I heard bits here and there, Family Fair, stuff like that. But I really wasn't into the outline of him. And, I know Michael Jackson had bought his catalog, but the radio at the time was playing all the hits that was happening in the streets and stuff like that. So he wasn't getting a lot of, and the funny thing about him, as influential as he is, and he's hugely influential, and I still say Sly and the Family Stone is the greatest band that America ever produced because he broke down racial barriers musically, men, women playing, etc., etc., and the impact of what he represented as a DJ, as a connoisseur. And he was one of one. Even though he came from the Ray Charles School of Music, he was one of one. However, let me get to the story. Obviously, Prince and the Revolution was big in the early 80s, and Michael Jackson was big, and Rick James was big. They were definitely three people that were templates of what he did, amongst others. But it was ironically a bus trip, Union Bridge. It was in Maryland, and there it was the late spring of '86. I was a teenager, and I bought this greatest hits tape from the local mall when you used to could do those things. Sign of Family Stone. And I want to take you higher, And obviously, I'd seen Prince and the Revolution doing America, and I'd seen all the nod and everything. But there's a ride going on, which I'll come to in a little bit. But when I sat there and listened to it, the songs just knocked me off my feet because all the beats sounded different, his vibe, and I was like, this is where Prince got that from. That's how Rick James and Michael Jackson and some of the others. And then thinking about Earth, Wind, and Fire, Maurice White said the impact of what he represented. And I said the owl and the vibe and Ohio players and so on. So it just hit you like a ton of bricks. Barcades, Cameo, Confunction, a lot of these acts. And then, he was my father's favorite funketeer too. That was told to me. And I went back. I remember getting there's a ride going on, and I remember that album cover was banned because you couldn't put the flag on the album cover. Yeah, you talk about, you think some places now are heavy censored. That was controversial. He went from that accessible, feel good, you know, came out of the civil rights movement to speaking his mind. Around the same time, obviously, when Shaft was big with Isaac Hayes and Marvin Gaye, what's going on, and with Curtis Mayfield, a lot of that people kind of downplay. His musical influences on people is prominent. Because I remember when I listened to old Curtis Mayfield records when he worked with with the 5 Star Steps, or listened to what Norman Whitfield was doing with the Temptations with Psychedelic Shack and other things, and the Jackson 5 dress code. Sly was a movement. It was a movement. And he was like Jimi Hendrix. He was a movement. It was from the James Brown P-Funk and the 60s, British Invasion, etc. But he was a movement. He was really doing things as a songwriter, a stylist, that he was a hybrid of so many different things. And in the fair world, he would have been even huger and bigger than he was. Because to me, as far as funk music goes, he's the Bob Marley of funk. Or however they try to talk about Bob Dylan as a poet, this guy was the guy that represented that. He really did. So, listening to Everybody is a Star and I Want to Take You Higher, and so many other songs that just hit me. Crossword Puzzle, which I like, you know, If You Want Me to Stay. First time I heard You Caught Me Smiling, and I'm going to tell you a funny story about that because I was listening to a Prince bootleg, White Girls Jam, and that guitar riff, and I was like, and he just took so many different things. It was blatant and obvious, but it was just an ode, as amongst others did from this man, this guy who changed the course of music history, an artist that, you just don't see the likes thereof, and just left such a lasting impact. And, when I listened to that tape, and I remember a few years later, I was playing with a musician buddy who was a big Prince fan, etc., etc. And when he heard it, he said, that's Prince, because all the beats were different. But this guy had predated all that. This guy had predated a lot of what you see. When Michael Jackson was melting potting with MTV and the layers and everything, Sly Stone not. New Edition did Everyday People. They were in the video. When you were talking about Rick James's musical hybrids and stylings, Sly Stone. When I think about so many artists, when I listen to the Commodores High on Sunshine, Heroes, that's a nod to what Sly Stone did. A lot of that stuff, you know, Barcades, when I think about a lot of the funk bands. But it was also ingrained into the pop rock because he had a folky thing going too. He had such a distinctiveness. Remember, he turned out Woodstock as he could turn out Soul Train. He had that innate ability to appeal to a wide range of people and yet keep us cool. But yet he didn't want to deal with the politics. He railed against it. He disappeared from it all. He seen the life. It wasn't cut out, and it wasn't meant to be what it was all cracked up to be. And that was the lesson that was learned, that they turned a guy who was a musical beast into a figure who stayed away from a lot of it, and understandably. However, in his peak, in his prime, you could put his catalog up with anybody you want to, and you can appreciate the harmonies. And ironically, Larry Graham, incredible bassist, and of course we all know about Larry Graham and Graham Central Station. Some of them records, it was actually Sly on the bass. People don't forget he was a multi-instrumentalist, guitar, bass, keyboards, the band leader, an enigma, a guy who transcended. And when I say the most important band that America ever produced, I didn't say my favorite band, because a band that he inspired was Earth, Wind and Fire, and Maurice White always said, no Sly Stone, no them. However, when I say the most important band, without Sly and the Family Stone, a lot of the R&B, pop, a lot of music that you hear would not be the same. Oh yeah, and there was an influence on the Red Hot Chili Peppers, because if you had any kind of groove or kind of vibe, you owed a nod to him. And obviously hip hop has sampled him and looped him, etc., etc. A lot of people have ate off this man's plate. It's unfortunate that he never got his due fully, because as hugely influential as he is, you never, yet now when we talk about the greats of the greats, it's a handful of people would mention him. Only people who would stay to it were true into the musical aficionados. But I wanted to take the time to tell him thank you and what he meant, because my young ears never forgot it. And as a teen going back and went back on all those records and would sit there and listen to them, listen to those grooves, listen to that harmony, that church, that clapping, that innovation. Because he was an innovator. He changed the course of music. And this isn't talked about now. And it wasn't just an R&B pop, because Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock changed their whole musical dynamics because of his impact and his influence. When you have cats who are avant-garde and something else completely, and they're changing their whole repertoires and their sets to match what you do, you definitely are on the pulse. And he was on the pulse in the Beatles so much. Now I remember when he worked with Jesse Johnson, did Crazy back in '86, and then he worked with Earth, Wind and Fire a few years later. And anytime I would hear him, or he worked with the Barcades, I remember I had that Animal album in '89. I had the Earth, Wind and Fire Heritage album. So here is records, Electric Water Spanking Babies with P-Funk in '81. When he would work with anybody, it was like obscure. And it was like how he would product place himself. And it was like, wow, there's a Sly Stone sighting, because he was almost like Bigfoot or like a UFO. That's how he hit musically. But understand, respect his privacy. He worked with Bobby Womack a whole lot. And I think the story I heard is one time he was with Womack in a car ride. And the story goes, he heard something on the radio. He said, they're playing me. He said, turn it off. He knew he came, he conquered, he saw his impact. When you see what's going on in LA, when you see riots, when you see protests, when you see people talking about things going on, think about this man's music, because that's what he was about. He made you deal with everyday people. He was a walking slogan. Different strokes, different folks. Think about that for the TV show. Think about his impact on the culture. Like I said before, others came along and got more notoriety, but they got off of his plate, and his plate changed the course as we know it. So I wanted to take the time to just, you got to pay your respects, your dues. I still remember going on that church trip. I remember what that Walkman sounded like. I remember the first time I got to listen to this man and his music and his creations, and how it left a lasting impact. And what a time that was, and what a way to be introduced to one of the most important musical figures ever. Rest in peace, Sly Stone, age 82. You'll never be forgotten. Respect one time and listen to the music, because it's relevant always.